Okay, viewers, second quick video on Adorno. One of the most helpful tools that Adorno gives us to understand our world is so many of his concepts are mediations that link the experience of the personal to the experience of the economic or the political or the socials or the macrologies. You have this micrology, and you have this set of mediations, very complicated, and then you have this macrology. So the small things and the big things, and they're related, and you can see and you can kind of think through the contradictions and use insights from here to understand things happening here, and you can use the insights into the big structures to understand the violences of the small everyday experiences, and thereby come to build a more effective and total picture. Here's one small example of how this form of thinking is very productive. If you look at the long sweep of history from 1492, the very beginning of the capitalist world system, all the way to today, there's one specific political logic that really stands out. You see this happening again and again and again and again. And that is the transition from empires of capital into capitalist empires. Now, this is not wordplay or trickery. I actually want you to think about the weight of history in those terms. An empire of capital. All the classic colonial empires were empires of capital. The Hapsburg Empire was an empire of capital, but it wasn't fully capitalist. There was a king or queen, and it was a feudal autocracy that ruled through various structures. It wasn't fully capitalist at all. And yet it was ruled by the categories of wealth accumulation. It was an empire of capital, specifically the American silver that the Hapsburg looted from the Americas, put on ships, brought to Europe to finance their wars of expansion, to transform the Habsburgs into the first capitalist superpower. That the Dutch come along and blow that model up, and then the British come along and take over from the Dutch, and then the Americans come along and become hegemon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Point is, this logic, empires of capital, turn over time into capitalist empires. And you see this logic everywhere. You see this with China. China was an empire of capital in the 19th century, quite a vigorous and powerful one under the Qing, expansionist, extremely powerful, just had the bad luck to be occupied by the British Empire, the single most powerful of the capitalist empires. And today, China is a fully capitalist empire in its own right, and it has an imperial formation that's throwing its weight around and trying to influence people and doing all the things that it accused the Western imperial nations of doing a generation ago. Now China is doing exactly the same tricks and giving loans to get people hooked on their debt and to get, buy Chinese goods, doing exactly the same thing. And why not? That was Marx's point, that capitalism is this system that's constantly expanding, enlarging, it transforms the whole world into its own image, and that's a necessary process. That's a deep part of human history, that we have to go through this commodity form, and only then can we talk about some kind of socialist alternatives. Another useful place to think about the application of Adorno, one of the most obvious examples here, when you think of empires of capital, one of the most obvious of these empires, and this explains a lot of political history of the 20th century, the Soviet Union. What was the Soviet Union if not an empire of capital? And in 1991, what does it turn into? 15 new national empires of capitalism. Of course, like all the others. How's that different from any of the other colonial empires? It's not. It's not. No, the Soviet Union was an empire. This has a long critique, of course. Bettelheim, C.L.R. James, even Trotsky in his day kind of understood little bits and pieces of the story, but what they didn't have was a good concept of an empire of capital. Another classic example from the historiography is the United States. The United States between 1789 and 1860. It's actually two empires. And to think about the schizophrenia here, there's the northern capitalist empires of the northern states, expansionary and colonizing and so forth. But what was the American South? It was a slave empire. But it was an empire of capital. Yes, the American South was an empire of capital, not a fully capitalist empire. And it had to conflict and contradict with the capitalist empire to the north, and then there'd be a fight. Eventually, it was going to explode. Now, this took different forms. Brazil didn't go through this. Brazil had slavery, but the capitalist empire emerges through a peaceful process because of the specific nature of Brazilian imperial society. So Brazil was a very powerful empire in the 19th century. So it didn't have to necessarily take a place of a civil war, but that was necessary in the American context to the specific structure of how the capitalism was set up. So there again, that gives us a way of thinking about history in a more complex way. The other great advantage of Adorno's concepts is once we have this emphasis, this link between the personal and the political, social, cultural, we can also use this to think of changes over time. We can think of the histories of subjects and subjectivities and the fights over those things. And then we can think of the macrological, large-scale battles over society, culture, art, history, etc., economy, and relate those two things over time and make linkages and think about the ways that the classic struggles against slavery in the 19th century for abolitionism, women's suffrage, human rights in general are linked to battles today over voting rights and access and control of giant corporations and whatnot. There's this long continuity of struggle and resistance that we need to be aware of and understand that history is not just a set of oppressions, it's also a set of resistances that we need to recover, think about, and occasionally celebrate and understand in order to build better resistances in the future.